Somewhere in your family tree, there may be a name that doesn't belong to you. Not really. A name that was assigned by a stranger to an infant nobody claimed, in the dark, beside a turning wheel. And if your ancestors came from Italy, that name might still be sitting in your phone book today, hiding in plain sight, carrying a secret 600 years old. Esposito means exposed, left out in the open. Trovato means found, discovered on a doorstep. Proietti comes from a Latin root meaning thrown away. Innocenti means innocent, after the hospital that took them in. These are among the most common surnames in all of Italy, and every single one of them points back to the same device: a hole in a wall, a rotating wooden cylinder just wide enough to hold a newborn. A mother would place her baby inside, turn the wheel, and hear a bell ring somewhere deep in the building. The baby vanished. The mother was never seen. The child was given a new name, and in most cases, that child did not survive. This system ran across an entire continent for 600 years. It processed millions of children, and the evidence is still embedded in the surnames of the living. In 1198, Pope Innocent III watched too many infants being pulled from the Tiber River. Desperate mothers, crushed by poverty and the shame of illegitimacy, were drowning their own children rather than face the world. His response was architectural. He issued a decree mandating a mechanism called the Ruta degli Esposti, the Wheel of the Exposed. It would be built into the walls of churches and hospitals so that women could surrender their babies in total anonymity. No witnesses, no questions, no names exchanged. The idea spread like fire. By the 1400s, Florence had one, then Naples, Rome, Milan, Bologna. By the time Napoleon issued his directive in January 1118, requiring Foundling wheels in every French district, 251 were already in operation across the country. Italy had over 1,200. Germany, Austria, Spain, Portugal, Brazil, Ireland, Russia, every major Catholic nation built some version of the same system: holes in walls, bells in the dark, babies disappearing on wooden cylinders into buildings that were supposed to save them. What happened inside those buildings deserves precision because the numbers are not ambiguous, and because the economics behind the system reveals something deeply disturbing. The institutions created a cycle that fed on itself. Foundling hospitals required wet nurses. Wet nurses were paid. A mother could abandon her own child at the wheel, then walk directly inside to apply for a paying position nursing someone else's infant. She would be prohibited from nursing her own baby, but she would receive wages. The very institution that tore families apart was financially sustained by the labor of the mothers it separated. It consumed the desperation it claimed to cure.
In Florence, the Ospedale degli Innocenti opened in 1445, the first purpose-built foundling hospital in Europe. Its very first child arrived on February 5th of that year, a girl. They named her Agata. In its early decades, the hospital received roughly 200 infants per year. By the late 1400s, intake had risen to 1,000 annually. By the time the wheel was permanently sealed in 1875, it was receiving over 2,000 babies every year. And the death rate, which had begun at roughly 30%, comparable to general infant mortality at the time, had climbed in certain years of the 1800s to 90%. 90%. 9 out of every 10 babies placed into that wheel did not come out alive. This is not speculation. It comes from archival research conducted inside the institution itself. London tells the same story with different specifics. In 1739, a sea captain named Thomas Coram finally achieved something he had spent 17 years fighting for. He had watched infants dying on the streets of one of the wealthiest cities on earth and refused to look away. He secured a royal charter from King George II, and on March 25, 1741, the London Foundling Hospital opened. 30 babies were admitted that first day, 18 boys, 12 girls. For its first 15 years, the hospital was selective, using a lottery, limiting admissions, keeping operations manageable. Mortality was grim but contained, around 61%. Then, in 1756, the British government offered funding with a single condition attached. The hospital had to accept every child brought to it. No restrictions, no refusals. They called it the General Reception. In 4 years, nearly 15,000 children passed through its doors. The mortality rate climbed to 81%. The hospital could not recruit enough wet nurses. Disease spread without control. Infants arrived already dying. Some carried hundreds of miles by paid intermediaries who transported them from the countryside in exchange for fees. Many arrived with broken bones. Some arrived already dead. When the government ended the general reception in 1760, the hospital quietly returned to selective admissions. The graves had already been filled. Someone watching this might reasonably argue that infant mortality was catastrophic everywhere during this era, and that is true. In London, between 1728 and 1737, at least 32% of all babies never reached their first birthday. Half did not survive to age 3. These were brutal centuries for children, and I sat with that counterargument for days before writing a single word. It nearly persuaded me that the foundling hospitals were simply mirrors of their time. Then I found the Dublin numbers, and the counterargument fell apart. The Dublin Foundling Hospital opened in 1730. Over roughly 100 years of operation, it admitted approximately 127,000 children. For every 1,000 admitted, 800 died. The estimated total death toll exceeds 100,000. But the number that made me stop reading entirely, the number I sat with in silence for a long time, was this. Between 1991 and 1996, 5,216 infants were admitted to the hospital's infirmary. 3 survived. Not 3%, 3 children. 5,213 babies entered that wing and never left alive. A House of Commons report documented it. The institution's own records confirmed it. And once you understand what was happening inside that infirmary, the number stops being a mystery and becomes something else.
When a child in Dublin fell ill, they received no treatment. They were transferred to the infirmary. Before being placed in a cot, they were stripped of their clothing. Those clothes were given to healthier children. They were then left to die. The cradles were so infested with vermin that workers had to throw them from the windows. They couldn't be carried down the stairs. The men assigned to destroy them required stimulants to keep working. The matron at one point demanded a salary increase because of the psychological damage caused by watching infant bodies thrown into pits and covered with lime. In 1738, 13 infant bodies were discovered on a sandbank near the River Cammock, close to the hospital grounds. Children were tattooed with identification numbers using spring-loaded devices. They were given opium, and none of this was concealed. Parliamentary inquiries documented these conditions repeatedly throughout the 1700s and 1800s. The institution kept operating for decades after the worst disclosures became public record. The children didn't even have to reach the hospitals to die. Across Europe, an entire class of workers emerged whose sole function was transporting infants from remote areas to foundling institutions. In France, they were called faiseuses d'ange, angel makers. In Ireland, they were called carrying nurses. A woman named Nell McCallum became notorious throughout Ulster for collecting infants and carrying them in wicker baskets on horseback, 8 to 10 babies at a time, bundled and stacked in open carts for journeys lasting over a week. The estimated mortality rate during transit alone exceeded 90%. A woman named Bridget Carney walked over 100 miles to Dublin, carrying her baby the entire way. She believed she was giving her child a chance at life. She handed the infant over at the door and walked home. She later sent a letter asking for the child back. The institution's records do not indicate whether that baby was still alive. And this is where my confidence in the official version of events began to fracture. A peer-reviewed paper published in 2023 in the journal Neonatology documented something I had not expected to find in an academic source. The Foundling hospitals deliberately falsified their own mortality statistics. They did not calculate deaths against admissions, which would have exposed the true rate. Instead, they measured deaths against the total number of children ever cared for, a far larger figure that made the percentages appear survivable. They knew the real numbers were indefensible, so they changed the math. And this was not one isolated institution making an error. The paper describes it as a consistent pattern across European foundling hospitals. They measured their own failure and then buried the measurement. I need to tell you about the tokens because they are the detail I cannot stop thinking about. When a mother placed her baby in the wheel, she often tucked something small inside with the child: a piece of jewelry, a coin cut in half, a torn scrap of fabric, a coral bead on a ribbon. These objects were meant as proof, evidence that this specific woman was the mother of this specific child, should she ever return to reclaim them. The London Foundling Museum holds roughly 400 of these tokens, with thousands more in storage. In Florence, over 13,000 identification objects survive in the archive, displayed inside 100 small wooden drawers that visitors can open one by one. Inside each drawer is something a mother left with her baby 200 to 500 years ago. One piece of fabric was embroidered with 2 words: cruel separation. Cruel separation. That was the message she chose to leave. The tokens were always kept by the institution. They were never given to the children. The system preserved the physical evidence of love while severing every connection that love represented.
Catherine the Great established the Moscow Imperial Foundling Home in 1763 as an Enlightenment experiment. Her advisor, Ivan Betskoy, designed it as a factory for model citizens. Abandoned children would be raised by the state, educated, refined, and released into Russian society as ideal human beings. The building stretched 379 meters along the Moskva River, one of the largest structures in Moscow. During Catherine's reign, 40,996 children were admitted. 35,309 of them perished inside, 87%. The ideal citizens never appeared. By the late 1800s, the institution was accepting 17,000 children per year, and the mortality rate had barely moved. Across the continent, the pattern repeated without exception. Naples, where the foundling system operated from roughly 1300 to 1875, saw mortality reach 80%. 1 in 5 babies born in early 1800s Paris was abandoned. In Milan, between 1845 and 1864, over 85,000 children passed through the system, nearly a third of all births in the city. And when Italy finally began closing the wheels in the 1860s and 1870s, something remarkable happened. An academic study published in 2025 found that closures led to a 55% decline in abandonment and a 10% drop in infant deaths. Closing the system saved children. The system itself was the danger. I should confess something. When I was deep inside the Dublin records, reading about the infirmary, about the lime pits, I nearly stopped writing this entirely, not because I doubted the evidence, because I couldn't find a way to tell it without reducing these children to data points. 5,216 is a number, but each unit of that number was a living infant with lungs and fingers and a mother who walked away believing she was doing the right thing. The tokens in those drawers are not artifacts. They are the last physical trace of bonds that were engineered to be destroyed. I kept asking myself, how do you tell this story without turning grief into content? I still don't have a clean answer. I decided the only honest approach was precision: dates, numbers, sources. Let the facts carry the weight that language cannot. So let me bring this to where it touches you directly. Because it does. The fifth most common surname in all of Italy is Colombo. It means pigeon. From 1475 to 1825, 350 years, every single baby abandoned at Milan's Foundling Hospital was given that name. The institution's symbol was a dove, so they named the children after it. 3.5 centuries of infants marked with a bird. Colombo remains the second most common surname in Milan today. In Naples, Esposito is the most common surname in the entire city. In Tuscany, Innocenti appears in phone books throughout the region. Proietti dominates central Italy. Trovato blankets Sicily. Each of these names is a wall inside someone's family tree, a point where the line stops and the records go silent. Genealogists call it a brick wall, but it is not a wall, it is a wheel, a rotating wooden cylinder built into the side of a building where someone's ancestor was placed, renamed, and absorbed into a system that killed most of the children it claimed to protect.
After Italian unification, laws were passed forbidding institutions from assigning surnames that revealed a child's origins. The official practice of marking children with names like abbandonato, meaning abandoned, or spurio, was ended in 1928, but the names persisted. Millions of people carry them today. Most have no idea what they mean. Your last name might be one of them, or your neighbor's, or someone sitting next to you who has spent years searching for ancestors and hitting the same wall over and over, not understanding why the trail vanishes. The buildings were repurposed. The records were filed in basements. The wheels were sealed. The Florence wheel has a plaque on it now, marking the date it closed, June 12, 1875. The last 2 children placed through it were given deliberate names. The boy was called Ultimo Lasciati, the last to be left. The girl was called Laudata Chiusuri, praise the closure. Even in its final act, the system used naming as a statement, the same casual authority it had exercised over 100,000 children before them. The tokens are still in the drawers, the archives are still in the basements, the surnames are still in the phone books. Nothing was destroyed, it was filed, categorized, stored, and allowed to recede from public conversation. Not because the evidence is insufficient, but because the questions it raises make institutions deeply uncomfortable. How does a system operate for 600 years, consistently failing at its stated purpose and face no reckoning? How do you process millions of infants through a mechanism built into a wall and call it charity? How do you falsify your own mortality records and maintain your reputation for another century? When this story ended, no one was prosecuted, no memorial was built. The buildings became museums and apartments and government offices. The wheels were sealed, plaques were installed, and history moved forward. But the surnames did not move forward. They stayed, passed from parent to child across 10, 15, 20 generations. How many people alive today are carrying the answer in their last name and have never once been told what it means?